The people who change your life rarely arrive with an introduction. They arrive disguised as an ordinary moment you almost ignore. Rain drifted across Manhattan in thin silver lines as I locked the front door of the neighborhood coffee shop where I worked every weekday. The evening rush had finally faded, leaving quiet sidewalks scattered with reflections from streetlights and passing taxis. I pulled my jacket tighter against the chilly breeze and started my usual walk toward the subway station. Most people hurried past with their eyes fixed on their phones, eager to escape the weather before it grew worse. Then I noticed him. A man about my age sat alone on an old wooden bench beside the small city park. His dark coat was damp from the rain, yet he made no effort to move beneath the nearby shelter. He simply watched the falling drops as though time itself had slowed around him. There was nothing unusual about his appearance except for the strange calm in his expression. He looked neither frightened nor confused. He looked like someone carrying thoughts too heavy to explain. Several pedestrians glanced toward him before quietly changing direction. Two women whispered to each other while pointing in his direction. A delivery driver shook his head and muttered that the man was probably trouble. Within moments the lonely bench had become something everyone noticed, but no one approached. I stood there for several seconds holding a paper cup of fresh coffee that I had planned to drink on the train ride home. Something inside me refused to keep walking. Maybe it was the way he stared into the rain without asking anyone for help. Maybe it was because loneliness has a face that people recognize only after experiencing it themselves. Whatever the reason, my feet carried me toward the bench before my mind had finished debating the decision. I stopped a few feet away and held out the warm cup. "You look like you could use this more than I can," I said with a small smile. The man slowly lifted his eyes toward mine. They were clear, steady, and unexpectedly kind. He accepted the coffee carefully, almost as though it were something far more valuable than a simple drink. "Thank you," he replied quietly. Most people decided I was not worth the interruption. I shrugged gently before sitting on the opposite end of the bench. People usually judge what they do not understand. A faint smile crossed his face. "And you?" I looked toward the rain-covered skyline before answering honestly. "I think everyone deserves one conversation before they deserve one opinion." For the first time his expression softened completely. We sat together in comfortable silence while traffic rolled through the wet streets beyond the park. He never asked for money. He never complained about his circumstances. Instead, he asked simple questions that somehow felt more meaningful than ordinary conversation. He wanted to know why I liked working in a neighborhood coffee shop. He asked what kind of books I enjoyed reading and whether I believed kindness could still survive inside a city where everyone seemed too busy to notice one another. I answered every question without hesitation because something about him inspired trust instead of caution. After nearly 30 minutes, my phone vibrated with a message from a coworker asking whether I had made it home safely. When I explained where I was, the reply came almost instantly. "Grace, are you serious? You are sitting with a complete stranger? Please leave before something goes wrong." I smiled at the screen before slipping the phone back into my pocket. The man noticed but politely looked away. "Someone is worried about you," he observed. "They think I am making a terrible mistake," I admitted with a quiet laugh. He lowered his eyes to the coffee cup still warming his hands. "Perhaps they are right." I gently shook my head. "I do not think so." He looked at me with genuine curiosity. "Why would you trust someone you know nothing about?" I smiled as the rain slowly began to fade. "Because sometimes the first thing people need is not suspicion. Sometimes they just need one person willing to believe they are exactly who they choose to be." He remained silent for several thoughtful moments before standing from the bench. "My name is Adrian," he said softly. "I hope we meet again." I watched him disappear into the mist between the trees, completely unaware that the quiet stranger I had trusted would soon change everything I believed about chance, loyalty, and destiny. The following morning the rain had disappeared, leaving Manhattan wrapped in bright sunshine that reflected from glass buildings and damp sidewalks. I arrived early at the neighborhood coffee shop, tied on my apron, and slipped into the familiar rhythm of preparing espresso, greeting regular customers, and remembering everyone's favorite order. Yet no matter how busy the morning became, my thoughts kept returning to the stranger from the park. There had been something impossible to explain about him. He spoke with quiet confidence, never trying to impress anyone, yet every sentence carried unusual depth. Around noon, my coworker Megan leaned against the counter while waiting for the next customer. "Please tell me you are not planning to meet that stranger again," she said with obvious concern. I smiled while arranging fresh pastries inside the display case. "I do not even know if I will ever see him again." She folded her arms. "Grace, nice people do not sit alone in parks during the rain without a reason." I laughed softly. "Maybe they simply need peace." She shook her head. "Or maybe they want someone to feel sorry for them." Before I could answer, another customer stepped forward, ending the conversation, but her words remained in my thoughts throughout the afternoon. After my shift ended, I decided to walk through the same park before heading home. I told myself it was only because the weather had finally become beautiful, yet a small part of me quietly wondered whether Adrian might still be there. The wooden bench stood beneath the same tall maple trees, warmed now by gentle sunlight instead of rain. To my surprise, Adrian sat exactly where I had left him the evening before, reading a well-worn novel with complete concentration. He looked up as my footsteps approached and smiled with genuine warmth. "I was hoping you might come back," he admitted. I laughed quietly. "That is either remarkable confidence or remarkable luck." He closed the book and held it up. "Perhaps both." I noticed the title and smiled. It was one of my favorite American classics. We spent the next hour talking about stories that had shaped our lives, memorable teachers, childhood dreams, and the surprising comfort found inside small neighborhood bookstores and coffee shops. Adrian never dominated the conversation. Instead, he listened carefully before asking thoughtful questions that made me reflect more deeply than I usually did. At one point I asked what he did for a living. He looked toward the skyline for several silent moments before answering with a faint smile. "Most days I spend my time making difficult decisions and hoping they improve more lives than they disappoint." It was an unusual answer, but somehow it felt completely sincere. I chose not to ask anything further. If he wanted to share more, he would do so in his own time. As evening approached, my phone rang. It was Megan again. "Where are you?" she asked immediately. "The park," I answered honestly. She sighed loudly. "Grace, everyone at the shop thinks you have completely lost your mind. You cannot keep trusting someone you barely know." I looked across the bench at Adrian, who politely pretended not to hear the conversation by returning his attention to the open book in his hands. "I appreciate your concern," I replied gently. "But he has done nothing except treat me with kindness and respect." Megan hesitated before quietly saying, "I just do not want you to get hurt." After the call ended, Adrian slowly closed the novel. "Your friends care about you," he observed. "They do," I answered. "Sometimes caring and understanding are not the same thing." Adrian nodded thoughtfully. "One day they may understand." As the sun disappeared behind the buildings, we stood and began walking toward the park entrance together. Just before we reached the sidewalk, Adrian paused for a brief moment as though listening to something only he could hear. Far across the street, an ordinary sedan quietly pulled away without attracting attention. Adrian simply smiled and continued walking beside me, while I remained completely unaware that unseen eyes had been watching over him from a respectful distance the entire time. Some people spend their entire lives hiding behind power, while others discover who they truly are only after living without it. The morning after our second meeting, Adrian quietly entered a modest apartment building before sunrise. Anyone passing by would have believed he lived an ordinary life. Minutes later, however, a secure elevator hidden behind an unmarked hallway carried him underground into a private executive complex unknown to the public. As the elevator doors opened, several professionally dressed assistants waited silently without speaking. They greeted him with respectful nods rather than formal ceremony because every movement had become routine after years of working beside him. Adrian walked calmly into a spacious conference room overlooking the Manhattan skyline, Large digital displays covered one wall, while reports rested neatly across a polished wooden table. No one sat before he did. Only after Adrian took his seat did the meeting quietly begin. His senior advisor opened a folder before speaking. Your security team confirmed the young woman has met you twice. She still does not know your identity. Adrian looked toward the window where morning sunlight slowly illuminated the city below. Has anyone approached her? The advisor answered immediately. No, sir. We followed your instructions exactly. She has not been disturbed. Adrian nodded with quiet satisfaction. Good. She deserves an ordinary life, not unnecessary attention. Another advisor carefully placed several photographs on the table. They showed Grace helping elderly customers carry grocery bags, volunteering during neighborhood food drives, and serving coffee with the same warm smile she had offered him on the rainy evening in the park. Adrian studied each image for several silent moments before closing the folder. Everything she showed me was genuine, he said softly. Nothing was performed because she believed no one important was watching. His advisors exchanged brief glances. One finally asked, Would you like us to explain who you are? Adrian slowly shook his head. Not yet. His answer surprised everyone in the room. People behave differently when they recognize power, he continued. I would rather discover how someone treats an ordinary stranger than how they treat a man surrounded by influence. The meeting moved on to discussions about investments, charitable foundations, and business responsibilities, yet Adrian's thoughts repeatedly returned to the park bench where a young woman had offered him a simple cup of coffee without asking for anything in return. Across the city I knew nothing about hidden conference rooms or private security teams. My life continued exactly as it always had. I arrived at the coffee shop before dawn, greeted familiar customers, and laughed with coworkers during the morning rush. Even Megan eventually stopped warning me about Adrian quite so often, although she still looked unconvinced whenever I mentioned him. I still think you are taking an unnecessary risk, she admitted one afternoon while wiping tables. Maybe, I replied with a smile. But sometimes trusting someone is also a risk worth taking. She sighed before smiling back. You have always believed the best about people. After work I walked toward the park once again, carrying 2 fresh coffees without even realizing I had purchased both automatically. Adrian was already sitting beneath the same maple tree, quietly reading another novel. When he noticed me approaching, his expression brightened with unmistakable relief. You remembered, he said. I handed him the second coffee and laughed softly. Apparently so did you. We spent the evening discussing favorite places in the city, forgotten dreams, and the surprising importance of small conversations. Neither of us noticed the dark sedan parked discreetly across the street, or the watchful professionals inside it, patiently ensuring that the ordinary friendship developing between 2 strangers remained undisturbed, because sometimes the greatest secrets are protected not by walls or locked doors but by the quiet choice to let kindness unfold naturally before revealing the truth. The greatest test of trust is not believing someone when life is easy. It is standing beside them when everyone else quietly walks away. Several days passed, and meeting Adrian after work slowly became part of my routine. We never planned our conversations. Somehow we always found ourselves returning to the same park bench as evening settled across Manhattan. We talked about books, family traditions, favorite neighborhoods, and the dreams people often abandoned because they believed it was too late to begin again. Adrian never complained about his own life, yet there was a quiet sadness hidden beneath his calm smile, as though he had spent years carrying responsibilities that few people could understand. One Friday afternoon the coffee shop became unusually crowded because of a nearby street festival. Customers filled every table while music drifted through the open windows. Just before my shift ended, I looked outside and noticed Adrian standing alone across the street, patiently waiting beneath a large oak tree instead of coming inside. He never wanted to interrupt my work or make me uncomfortable. That simple gesture somehow made me trust him even more. Megan followed my eyes toward the window and sighed. He is back again. I smiled without looking away. He said he would stop by after work. She lowered her voice. Grace, people have started talking. Some customers think he is following you. I looked at Adrian once more. He was reading a book while quietly waiting, paying no attention to anyone around him. He has never asked me for anything, I answered. He only treats me with respect. Megan shook her head gently. Sometimes people hide who they really are. Her words lingered in my mind, but they disappeared the moment I stepped outside. Adrian closed his book and smiled warmly. I hope I did not cause any trouble. I laughed softly. Only the usual concern from people who think kindness is dangerous. He looked thoughtful before asking, And what do you think? I smiled. I think fear often speaks louder than experience. We decided to walk through the street festival together. Families browsed local craft booths while musicians performed on small outdoor stages. Children laughed as colorful lights slowly illuminated the sidewalks. Everything felt peaceful until an elderly vendor accidentally dropped several boxes of handmade candles onto the pavement. Most pedestrians stepped around the scattered items, worried about being delayed. Without saying a word, Adrian immediately knelt to help gather every box while I joined him. Together we carefully arranged everything back onto the display table. The grateful vendor smiled with relief. Thank you both, she said sincerely. Many people saw what happened, but only you stopped. Adrian simply smiled. Everyone deserves a little help now and then. As we continued walking, I noticed several strangers watching us with puzzled expressions. Perhaps they wondered why someone dressed as simply as Adrian carried himself with such quiet confidence. Perhaps they wondered why I trusted him so completely. Across the street, however, another pair of watchful eyes belonged to a man wearing a dark business suit. He spoke briefly into a discreet communication device before calmly returning to an unremarkable sedan parked nearby. Adrian noticed the vehicle for only a fraction of a second but gave no sign that he recognized it. Instead, he turned toward me with the same peaceful expression he had worn since the day we first met. Thank you, he said unexpectedly. For what? I asked. He looked toward the evening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear above the city lights. For allowing me to spend these days as an ordinary man. Before I could ask what he meant, a distant line of headlights slowly appeared at the far end of the boulevard, still too far away for anyone to realize that destiny was quietly approaching, one vehicle at a time. Sometimes the truth does not announce itself with words. Sometimes it arrives with engines, silence, and the sudden realization that everything you believed was incomplete. The line of headlights continued growing brighter until the entire boulevard seemed to slow around us. One after another, sleek black sport utility vehicles turned onto the street with quiet precision. They did not race or create chaos. They moved with perfect discipline, stopping one by one along the curb until 25 identical black vehicles formed an unbroken line stretching farther than I could easily count. Conversations throughout the street festival gradually faded into silence. Musicians lowered their instruments. Families paused in the middle of the sidewalk. Even the food vendors stopped serving customers as everyone instinctively looked toward the extraordinary procession. My first thought was that some important public official must be visiting the neighborhood. Adrian remained completely calm beside me, his expression unchanged. The doors of the first vehicle opened almost simultaneously with the others. Professionally dressed men and women stepped onto the sidewalk with remarkable composure. They wore dark suits, discreet communication devices, and calm expressions that reflected preparation rather than intimidation. None of them looked toward the gathering crowd. Every person walked directly toward Adrian with measured confidence before stopping several feet away. Then, in perfect unison, they respectfully lowered their heads. The entire street became completely silent. One distinguished gentleman stepped forward first. Mr. Brooks, he said with quiet respect, everything is prepared. We apologize for interrupting your evening, but the board has arrived and the international conference cannot begin without you. My heart nearly stopped. I slowly turned toward Adrian, searching his face for some sign that this incredible scene was a misunderstanding. Instead, He offered me the same gentle smile he had worn since the rainy evening when I first handed him a cup of coffee. Around us, dozens of neighbors, customers from the coffee shop, festival visitors, and even Megan stood frozen in complete disbelief. Only minutes earlier they had believed Adrian was simply an ordinary stranger sitting alone in the park. Now 25 black sport utility vehicles and an entire professional team had quietly revealed a reality no one had imagined. Adrian looked toward his waiting colleagues before returning his attention to me. "I owe you an explanation," he said softly. I could barely find my voice. "Who are you?" He paused for a brief moment, almost reluctant to answer. "My full name is Adrian Brooks. I oversee an international organization that requires more attention than I sometimes wish it did." He never mentioned titles or wealth. He never spoke with pride. Yet everyone surrounding us immediately understood that the man standing beside me carried extraordinary responsibility. Megan slowly approached, still unable to hide her astonishment. She looked at me before looking at Adrian again. "Grace," she whispered, "this is the man everyone thought you should avoid." I smiled gently, still trying to absorb everything unfolding before my eyes. "He never gave me a reason not to trust him." Adrian's senior advisor stepped forward respectfully and handed him a leather portfolio. Adrian accepted it before quietly turning back toward me. "These past few days have been the most ordinary I have experienced in many years," he admitted. "Thank you for treating me like a human being before you knew anything else about me." The evening breeze carried the distant sound of children laughing somewhere beyond the festival lights as Adrian prepared to leave. Before entering the first vehicle, he looked at me one last time. "If you are willing," he said warmly, "I would like our conversations to continue." As the 25 black sport utility vehicles slowly departed beneath the glowing Manhattan skyline, I remained standing in the quiet street surrounded by people whose opinions had changed in a single unforgettable evening, finally understanding that trust had never been the mistake everyone believed it was. It had been the beginning of a story none of us could have predicted. The greatest rewards are often offered after the moment, when you expected nothing in return. The morning after the unforgettable procession of black sport utility vehicles, Manhattan seemed exactly the same, yet everything in my life felt completely different. Customers at the coffee shop recognized me from the street festival, and quietly whispered as they ordered their drinks. Some smiled with curiosity while others apologized for the assumptions they had made about Adrian. Even Megan looked embarrassed as she handed me a fresh apron before opening the shop. "I owe you an apology," she admitted softly. "I judged someone I had never even spoken to." I smiled gently while preparing the espresso machine. "Most people did. The difference is that you are willing to admit it." She laughed quietly before shaking her head. "I still cannot believe 25 black sport utility vehicles came looking for the same man who sat alone on a park bench." Neither could I. Late that afternoon, a simple cream-colored envelope arrived at the coffee shop with my name written neatly across the front. There was no company logo, no official seal, only a handwritten note inside. "If you have time this evening, I would appreciate one more conversation. The coffee will be my turn. Adrian." The message made me smile. When my shift ended, a single black sedan waited discreetly outside rather than the long procession everyone now expected. The driver politely greeted me before taking me to a quiet office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The building itself appeared elegant but surprisingly understated. Inside, Adrian greeted me exactly as he always had, wearing a simple dark suit instead of the expensive image many people might have expected. He smiled warmly as though nothing important had changed between us. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You made it sound like we were simply meeting for coffee," I replied with a smile. He laughed softly. "Because we are." We spent nearly an hour talking exactly as we always had. There were no dramatic speeches or displays of influence. Adrian answered every question I asked honestly. He explained that his work required privacy, careful decisions, and constant responsibility, but he never glorified the position he held. "The titles matter far less than the people affected by the decisions," he said quietly. Before I left, Adrian placed a small folder on the table. "There is something I would like to offer you." Inside were documents establishing a scholarship fund in my name, financial support for the neighborhood coffee shop's employee education program, and resources for the community literacy projects where I volunteered every weekend. I looked up in surprise. "This is far too much." Adrian gently shook his head. "None of it is for luxury. Every part of it supports the things you already cared about before we met." I remained silent for a long moment before carefully closing the folder. "May I ask for one change?" Adrian nodded immediately. "Anything." I smiled. "Please remove my name from every project. Let the children remember the opportunities, not the person who requested them." Adrian studied me for several thoughtful seconds before smiling with unmistakable admiration. "That answer does not surprise me." He pressed a button beside his desk, and one of his senior advisors quietly entered the room. "Revise every document," Adrian instructed. "The programs will remain exactly as planned, but no individual's name will appear. Let the work speak for itself." The advisor nodded respectfully before leaving without another question. Adrian looked back toward me with genuine gratitude. "You continue teaching me lessons I never expected to learn." I smiled warmly. "Perhaps we are simply reminding each other what truly matters." As evening settled across the city lights beyond the windows, I realized that the greatest surprise had never been discovering who Adrian Brooks really was. The greatest surprise was learning that extraordinary influence placed in the hands of someone willing to listen could become something far more meaningful than power alone, and together we quietly began imagining how one unexpected friendship might improve countless ordinary lives. The most valuable thing trust can create is not opportunity. It is the courage to use opportunity for someone else. Over the following months, the quiet conversation Adrian and I shared inside his office slowly became the beginning of something much larger than either of us had imagined. Instead of announcing ambitious projects with elaborate ceremonies, we focused on listening first. Every Saturday morning we visited community centers, neighborhood libraries, youth programs, and family shelters across Manhattan. Adrian insisted on arriving without formal introductions whenever possible. He wanted to hear honest opinions before anyone recognized him. Watching him speak with teachers, volunteers, and parents reminded me of the man I had first met sitting alone on a rainy park bench. The only difference now was that I finally understood the weight he quietly carried every day. One afternoon we visited a small after-school learning center struggling to remain open because of outdated equipment and limited resources. Children shared aging computers while volunteers repaired broken furniture between classes. Adrian spent nearly an hour speaking with the teachers, asking thoughtful questions about what the students truly needed rather than what appeared impressive on paper. As we walked back toward the entrance, he looked at me with a thoughtful smile. "Months ago I would have measured success by the size of the investment," he admitted. "Now I measure it by the number of children who will smile because of it." I smiled warmly. "That is a much better way to count." Within weeks the learning center received everything it needed. New computers arrived, classrooms were renovated, teachers received additional training, and free tutoring programs expanded throughout the neighborhood. Adrian refused to allow press conferences or promotional banners. Whenever reporters requested interviews, he politely redirected their attention toward the educators and volunteers who work there every day. "They are the real reason this place succeeds," he always replied. His quiet humility inspired everyone around him. Even members of his executive team gradually adopted the same approach. During one planning meeting, I watched senior advisors spend more time discussing scholarship opportunities than financial reports. When the meeting ended, Adrian quietly thanked them. "Influence becomes meaningful only after it improves someone else's future," he said. The room remained silent for a moment before several advisors nodded with genuine respect. Later that evening we returned to the familiar park where our friendship had first begun. The same wooden bench still overlooked the quiet walking path beneath the maple trees. Families strolled peacefully through the park while children chased one another across the grass. Adrian looked around before laughing softly. I never imagined this bench would become the most important meeting place of my life. I sat beside him with a smile. Neither did I. He looked toward the city skyline glowing beyond the trees. Do you know what I remember most about that first evening? I shook my head. You offered me coffee before you asked me a single question. I laughed quietly. I thought you looked cold. He nodded. Most people wanted answers before offering kindness. You offered kindness first. His words lingered in the peaceful evening air as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the buildings. I realized that nothing remarkable had happened because one powerful man entered my life. Everything remarkable had happened because two ordinary conversations had slowly become a shared purpose. Trust had grown into friendship, friendship had become meaningful action, and meaningful action was now changing lives far beyond either of our own. Sitting together beneath the same trees where strangers had once questioned my judgment, I finally understood that believing in one person had quietly inspired hundreds of others to believe in one another, and that simple chain of trust had become the most extraordinary legacy either of us could ever hope to leave behind. Legacies are not built on the day people discover your name. They are built on the day they begin believing in themselves because someone believed in them first. Nearly a year passed before I truly understood how far one simple decision had traveled beyond that rainy evening in the park. The scholarship programs continued expanding into neighborhoods that had long been overlooked. Small libraries stayed open later so children could finish their homework in safe and welcoming spaces. Community centers welcomed new volunteers every week, not because they were promised recognition, but because they had witnessed genuine generosity creating lasting change. Adrian rarely attended public ceremonies. Whenever invitations arrived, he quietly suggested that local teachers, volunteers, and community leaders accept the recognition instead. He believed that those who served every day deserved the applause far more than those who simply provided resources. Watching him make that choice over and over again reminded me that true leadership often speaks most clearly through humility. One crisp autumn afternoon we visited the first learning center we had helped restore together. The once aging classrooms were now filled with bright colors, updated bookshelves, modern computers, and students whose excitement could be heard long before we opened the front door. A young boy ran toward us holding a science project he had proudly completed. He thanked the teachers first, then smiled at Adrian without recognizing the influence standing quietly before him. Adrian knelt beside the child and asked thoughtful questions about his experiment, listening with complete attention as though nothing else in the world mattered. As we walked through the building, several parents stopped to express their gratitude. They thanked the volunteers, the educators, and everyone who had made the center possible. Very few knew Adrian's full identity, exactly as he preferred. Outside the building we paused beneath golden maple trees as leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk. Adrian looked toward the children laughing on the playground before speaking softly. For years I believed respect came from authority, he admitted. Now I understand that respect grows naturally when people know you care about their future. I smiled because I remembered the quiet stranger who had once accepted a simple cup of coffee with grateful hands. You already carried influence, I replied. You simply discovered a better way to use it. He laughed quietly before looking toward the skyline glowing in the distance. You helped me discover it. Later that evening we returned once again to the familiar park bench where everything had begun. The city sounded different now, not because Manhattan had changed, but because my own perspective had. The same pathways, the same trees, and the same benches reminded me that extraordinary moments often begin inside ordinary places. Adrian looked around with peaceful contentment. If I had introduced myself on the first day, we would never have shared any of this, he said. I nodded slowly. People would have treated you differently. He smiled warmly. Including you? I shook my head with quiet certainty. No. I would still have offered you the coffee. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. We simply watched families walking together beneath the evening lights while children laughed in the distance. It felt strangely perfect that the place where strangers once questioned my judgment had become the place where hope quietly returned to both of us. I realized then that the greatest miracle had never been the arrival of 25 black sport utility vehicles or the revelation of Adrian's remarkable position. The greatest miracle was that one ordinary act of trust had become a legacy of kindness carried forward by countless people who would never know how the story truly began, proving that the smallest choice made with an open heart can continue changing lives long after the moment itself has passed. The true ending of a story is never written on the day everything changes. It is written years later when the kindness that began it continues growing without asking anyone to remember where it started. 2 years passed more quickly than either Adrian or I expected. The small neighborhood projects we once discussed over coffee had grown into a network of learning centers, libraries, scholarship programs, and volunteer partnerships reaching communities across the city. Every new location carried the same quiet purpose. No statues. No portraits. No names carved into marble. Only open doors, welcoming classrooms, and opportunities waiting for people who simply needed someone to believe in them. On a bright spring morning, Adrian invited me to attend the opening of the newest community learning center. The building overlooked the Hudson River, surrounded by flowering trees and families gathering beneath clear blue skies. Children hurried through the entrance carrying backpacks while teachers welcomed them with genuine excitement. Volunteers arranged books across freshly built shelves, and local musicians filled the courtyard with gentle melodies. It felt less like a ceremony and more like a celebration of ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things together. Adrian stood beside me wearing the same quiet smile I remembered from the first evening we met. His position had never changed, but his definition of success had transformed completely. Before the ribbon was cut, one of the organizers unexpectedly invited him to speak. Adrian paused for a moment before stepping toward the microphone. The crowd became completely silent. He looked across the families, the teachers, the students, and the volunteers before speaking with calm sincerity. Many people believe that life changes because someone powerful arrives at the right moment, he began. My life changed because one ordinary person chose kindness before asking questions. That decision reminded me that influence has its greatest value only when it creates opportunities for others. He turned toward me with grateful eyes, but never mentioned my name. He respected my wish that the work should always remain larger than any individual. The audience responded with warm applause, not because of status, but because every person present recognized the truth inside his words. After the ceremony ended, children explored the library while parents thanked the teachers and volunteers who had made the center possible. Adrian and I quietly slipped away from the celebration and walked toward the small park beside the river. The peaceful path reminded us both of another park years earlier where everything had begun with a single paper cup of coffee. We sat together on a wooden bench overlooking the water as the afternoon sunlight reflected across gentle waves. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had kept walking that evening? Adrian asked softly. I smiled while watching a young family laugh together nearby. Sometimes, I admitted. Then I remember that kindness is never wasted, even when we never discover the ending. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. You taught me that the greatest investment is trust placed in the right heart. I laughed quietly. And you proved that trust can change far more lives than either of us imagined. We remained there for several peaceful minutes, saying nothing at all. We no longer needed long conversations to understand one another. The city continued moving around us, just as it had on the rainy evening when we first met as strangers. The difference was that now countless children were reading books inside welcoming libraries, students were chasing dreams made possible by scholarships, and families were building brighter futures because one simple choice had quietly inspired another. As the sun slowly settled beyond the skyline, I realized that people would probably remember the remarkable convoy of black sport utility vehicles for many years. They would speak about the mystery, the surprise, and the revelation. But the moment that truly mattered would always remain invisible to everyone except Adrian and me. It was the quiet decision to offer kindness without expecting anything in return. Everything else was only the echo of that single choice, proving that destiny rarely begins with extraordinary power. More often, it begins with an ordinary heart willing to trust before the rest of the world understands why.